Thank you very much. Thank you, and good morning. So, yeah, I'm Dave Verwer. I do run iOS Dev Weekly, which is a weekly newsletter, comes out every Friday. Does anyone subscribe? Fantastic. I also run a few other things. So I run a job site for iOS developer. I have a blog, and I run a couple of other sites as well. And in fact, I just launched a new project a few weeks back called the Swift Package Manager Library. So obviously the Swift Package Manager is now coming to iOS. And this is an index of every Swift package that supports the Swift Package Manager that I know of. There's 3,500 there so far. So if you're looking for a new package for your project, maybe, give it a try. But I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about today is making your app feel at home on iOS 13. So what does that mean? Well, partly it's about something called platform fit. So you've probably heard this term before. Does your application feel like it belongs on the platform that it's running on? Apps designed for a desktop should operate smoothly and appropriately for the platform they're running on. So desktop applications should fit nicely on a big screen. Phone applications should fit nicely on a tiny screen. TV applications should fit nicely viewed from across the room. And that's generally what platform fit means. And most applications get this right, because it causes big problems if you don't get this right. If you design a TV application with tiny fonts, it's very obvious very quickly that nobody's going to be able to use your application. So most applications get this right. What I'm going to talk about today is something a bit more subtle than that, which is whether your app feels at home on a platform. Does the application really take advantage of the features of the platform? Does it follow the design conventions set out by the platform owner? And some applications struggle with this a little bit more than they do with platform fit. Especially if the application is cross-platform. So the default with cross-platform applications is to try and make both platforms look exactly the same. And sometimes that can mean that the application looks different to the rest of the platform that it is operating on. So for example, the Google applications on iOS, they use Google conventions, they use material design. The share icon on the Google applications is not the iOS share icon. They tend to use the Android share icon, right? Which is, it's okay. It doesn't mean your application isn't usable, but it doesn't quite match the platform to the same extent as the Apple applications or other third-party applications. So how do you make your application feel at home? Part of it is to look at what Apple do. And you might as well call this process kind of how to copy Apple, basically. Because what we're going to do is we're going to look very closely at the Apple applications, the first-party applications, photos, mail, maps, that kind of thing. And we're going to see what Apple do and see if we can take inspiration from those designs and bring them to our applications so that we can make everything feel at home a little bit more. So let's go back in time. This is a screenshot of the home screen of the very first iOS version, or actually it was called iPhone OS back in the beginning. Everyone remember that it was called iPhone OS? If you look at this, this just looks crazy different to what we see today, right? Does anyone remember that the dock was like a pitted metal thing in iOS 1? When I looked at this screenshot, I was surprised to see that. I'd forgotten that. And this is what we were faced with 10 or 11 years ago. And design on iOS progressed through fairly predictably to this stage. This is a screenshot of iOS 6. So does anyone remember, by the way, the glossy icons? You see the little half gloss on the icons. I remembered that fondly when I was looking at this screenshot. So design progressed through from iOS 1 through iOS 6, and then everything changed. I was actually sitting in the audience at WWDC when this video came on. It was at the very beginning of the conference. And this was just a complete change in the design of iOS. And I remember at one point thinking, especially actually when this part of the video played, I remember thinking, are these icons real? Like, they look like they weren't quite finished. It was such a huge change from what we'd been used to that I actually thought, well, these are just maybe beta icons, and we'll get the finished icons later. But of course, it wasn't that. These were the finished icons. It was just such a huge change. And that was really the biggest change that we've had in iOS design. And from iOS 7 through to today with iOS 13, things have progressed in a fairly predictable and linear fashion. But that doesn't mean there haven't been changes. So here we are, 6 years later. iOS 13 just got released a few weeks ago. And so when we talk about making our application feel at home on iOS 13, what you might think I'm going to talk about today is maybe the new modal presentation format, which is brand new for iOS 13. We're not going to talk about that today. You might think we're going to talk about dark mode, and we're not going to talk about dark mode. You might think we're going to talk about the new color palettes that are standard now in iOS. All of these things are great. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. There's also materials. You can have transparencies with blurs and glosses and that kind of stuff. The best place to find out about all of that is the WWDC videos. You can get the technical details of how to implement all of this there. We're going to talk about something a little more subtle today. We're going to talk about buttons. So one of the biggest changes with iOS 7 was how buttons are represented. Suddenly, this was a button. It doesn't look much like a button. And certainly, if you look back to what buttons look like on iOS 6, just look how buttony these buttons are. Like, there's absolutely no doubt that any of those buttons are tappable. They scream, tap me on those buttons, right? And in iOS 7, it all changed to using color to identify what was a button and what wasn't. So there was no border, there was no distinguishing features to the text at all, apart from just using color. We didn't have a border, we didn't have any kind of background. This, I think, would look much more like a button than the first version did. So where are we with iOS 13? The good news is that buttons, certainly in some places, look more like buttons. So these are all screenshots from iOS 13. And certainly they use borders and backgrounds now. We've got also that new reminder button. The plus symbol is very much looking like a button now, which is good, with just the text next to it. And in fact, even some of the new controls in iOS 13 use animation to indicate their button qualities. So the new segmented controls, the buttons for the two segments, they animate as you tap them. But that doesn't mean we haven't completely got rid of the old style buttons, because these screenshots here are also from iOS 13. So what we have at the moment is quite a mix of styles. So these are a set of buttons that I went and captured from standard iOS applications. In fact, all of these different button styles are from just 3 applications. These are from Maps, Wallet, and Reminders. And we've got such a varied set of different design styles here. Some of these buttons have strong background colors with white text. Some of them have very faint background colors, like the gray backgrounds there, with a strong colored text. Some of them have small fonts in the middle here. Some of them had big fonts filling the whole button. There's a huge different variety. And some of them are, again, just like iOS 7, some of them are just colored text. So as I was putting this presentation together, I thought, well, maybe I should try and find all the different styles of buttons in iOS 13. And I picked a button that a lot of applications use, which is an add button. And I thought, well, I wonder how many different types of add buttons I can find in just Apple's apps on the platform. And this is what I found. There's a lot of different types of add buttons. Is anyone surprised that there's so many different add buttons in iOS? I certainly was. Some of them use capitalized text, some of them use kind of all caps text. There's even 3 different weights of the plus glyph. So we have like a really lightweight version, a medium, and then a heavyweight version. And these are scattered all over the operating system. So you might imagine that I'm about to say that everything on iOS 13 is inconsistent and badly designed, and everything is terrible, and what we've made is a huge regression back in design. But actually, I'm not going to make that conclusion. I think everything's okay. Having every button look exactly the same wouldn't actually be a good thing for the platform, because there is hierarchy in our user interfaces. So let's take an example. The Reminders application. So here is the iOS 13 Reminders application, and we have on this screen 4 different types of buttons. We have the Lists button, with the back button right at the very top. We have on the right-hand side there, we have a ... button, which behind that menu is hidden a menu full of things like whether to show or hide completed reminders or to reorder reminders or something like that. We then have the buttons that are actually there to tick off the to-do items as you've done them, right? So you hit the button next to the item that you've just done. And finally, at the bottom of the screen here, I don't know whether you can see that, but at the bottom of the screen, you also have this new reminder button. So we've got 4 different styles of button on one screen. That's okay, because these buttons are not all equal. Some of these buttons, if you think about what are you on this screen to do, the most likely thing that you're here to do is either to add a new reminder to remind yourself to do something, or to say, I did a thing, it's done, I've checked it off. So those 2 buttons need to be more important than the back button, because what does the back button do? The back button goes back to a list of to-do lists. Now that's a good feature of reminders, but it's probably not a feature that most people even use. I think most people have just one set of reminders. They probably put all their reminders in the same list, and as they do the things, they check them off, and that's it. And you could certainly live a perfectly happy life with just one set of reminders. It's not necessary to have multiple different sets of reminders. So that button that goes back to the previous screen to go to the list of sets of reminders, it's not as important. So the fact that that is less important in the hierarchy of this design is fine. In fact, it's a good thing. Again, that ... button on the top right-hand side is not as important. The fact that you can rearrange these icons or should turn off completed items, that's not something you're going to do every day. The most likely reason you're here is to check a thing off or to add a new reminder. So those 2 buttons are prominent, they're obvious, and the other 2 buttons are set into the background. So for a little bit of fun, I redesigned this screen, well, not redesigned it, but I did a version of this screen that had the same kind of button design for each of those 2 buttons that we just talked about. And I think you'll agree that this version is instantly less usable. Those 2 buttons, they're not as important. They don't need to be highlighted. Not everything needs to look the same. Consistency doesn't mean that every button needs to be exactly the same design. What consistency means is that the user interface that you present to people is consistent with the rest of the operating system. So if you look around at this concept across all of the different Apple applications, you'll see that they use hierarchy in their designs to indicate what's important on each different screen. And some things fade into the background, and some things become very prominent. So when you're looking at your application for iOS 13, remember that not everything needs to look exactly the same, but that consistency means fitting in well with the other applications, and look at the other applications. Look at the buttons that are in other applications, and see what you can take from that for your own application. So that's buttons. Let's also talk about discovery. So discovery in iOS has always been difficult. In fact, discovery on mobile has always been difficult. Even after 10 years of mobile user interfaces, it still feels like quite a young platform. Certainly, it's a lot more mature than it used to be now, but we haven't. I don't think we've solved all of the problems of usability on mobile by any stretch of the imagination. And because we run our applications on very small screens, it's difficult to include things like help or guidance or any kind of text or user interface that shows people how to use our application, because it's on such a small screen, it just gets in the way. And so what we've seen over the last 10 years is people focus in on a couple of quite well-established now ways of solving this problem. So you're probably quite familiar, when you open up a new application, you'll see this at the bottom of the screen. And as soon as you see this, you know what's coming. You get some kind of walkthrough, right? So it tells you, here's how you use my application, here are some of the features, and here's how you buy the premium upgrade, right? Because that's always the last step of any walkthrough. These are okay, but walkthroughs generally are not great for discovery. When you download an application and you open it for the first time, you've probably downloaded that application because you had a problem to solve. What you're probably not in the mood to do is find out every single last feature of the application you're about to use. But when you're designing a walkthrough, it's very tempting to try and put every single feature that your application has in that walkthrough, because you've worked really hard on every single feature. And the natural reaction is to want to tell people how wonderful your application is, because if you tell people how wonderful your application is, they'll instantly believe you and buy your premium upgrade, right? That's how it works. People need to be in the right frame of mind to learn. And opening an application for the first time is not necessarily the right place to tell them everything about your application. It's no surprise that these have become standard. And in fact, Apple use these. And so these are taken from iOS 13 screenshots. Apple have really lent into this in terms of their design, and almost every application in iOS 13 will present you with some kind of welcome to or what's new in, and they all have slightly different designs, but they're all very much the same format. One thing Apple don't do is they don't use multiple screens, and I think this is something we can learn from, because if you see that list of dots at the bottom of the screen, you feel like, well, I know how many pages I need to swipe through before I can get to actually do what I bought this app for. So it's like the swiping Olympics, right? How fast can I swipe through all these screens so that I can just get into the application and do my thing? So Apple don't do that, but they do use these welcome screens. But they tend to limit it just to 3 or maybe 4 items. They all have an icon next to the text. They all have a single sentence of text with a heading. And this is okay. I'm not saying you shouldn't do this. I'm just saying that don't overload your walkthroughs. It's okay to say, like, here's some of the stuff you can do in my application, but not a 10-page tutorial on how to use your application. The next thing I want to talk about is in-application assistance. So on iOS 13, the first time you use the iOS 13 keyboard, this is what you see. So this replaces the keyboard, and instead is an animation showing you how to use the swipe keyboard, which is where you swipe across the keys to make words instead of tapping them. This is okay because this is a new feature. People don't necessarily know about this feature. But again, it's the wrong time to present this to people. So if you think about how people are actually going to use your application, when they see this screen, it's the first time that the keyboard has been shown after doing the upgrade. So what's the most likely task that people are going to do when they first see the keyboard? They're probably trying to send a message to somebody in Messages or WhatsApp or Telegram or whatever it is. That's probably the first time they're going to see the keyboard. So in the user's mind, they have a task to do. I want to send a message to my friend. I get this animation coming up. I don't want to see an animation right now. I want to send a message to my friend. That's why I'm here. So instantly, they'll just tap continue. They won't read that. They won't try and learn about the feature. They'll just instantly tap continue. In fact, I predict that if you asked, so everyone here presumably has upgraded to iOS 13 now? Yeah? How many of you think you didn't see this screen? You didn't know about this screen? Okay. So, I can guarantee that at some point you saw this screen, but your mind wasn't ready to learn at that point. And so the instant thing you do is continue, and your mind is so distracted by your actual task that you'll forget that this even exists. There's another one of these, which is explaining how to do the undo gestures. So there's a new undo gesture in iOS 13. Again, I think I was shown this animation on how to do the undo gesture. I actually can't even remember what the undo gesture is because I wasn't in the mood to learn about it when I saw this screen for the first time. So it's really important to think about what the user is trying to do at the point where you're going to try and show them some, where you're going to try and educate them on how to use your application. So let's talk about some of the places where Apple do get this right, because I think there's some great examples in iOS 13, and iOS in general, actually, on where Apple really get this right. And one of those places is with Siri. So you might have seen this screen. This screen isn't actually new in iOS 13. This has been in the operating system for a long time. If you press the button to call up Siri and then don't say anything, you'll see this screen come up, and it will say, here are some of the things that you can do with Siri. This has been around for a long time, but it's good because this screen is only ever shown if the user hesitates. So they've summoned Siri, but maybe they don't quite know what Siri does. And so it pauses just for a second. Because if you know exactly what you want to ask Siri, you'll never see this screen. It doesn't get in the way. But if you pause, if you hesitate, it then says, OK, maybe you're struggling to figure out what to do with this feature. And so it shows you some assistance. And in iOS 13, they've taken this concept and they've put it all around the operating system. So, for example, 3 examples here. Top left, this is shown in the list of messages. If you open up Messages and on iOS 13, at the top of the list, you'll see this talk instead of type. It tells you that basically you can use Siri to send a message. I really like this because if you go into Messages, it's not interrupting you. It's not getting in the way of what you wanted to do. You can still go, you can select the conversation you were wanting to add to, tap it, type your message, carry on. And if you ignore this prompt at the top, that's okay. It's going to be there next time you come in. When you have a chance, you read it, you dismiss it, and then you'll never see it again. But until you take that action to say, like, I've read this message, I'm going to hit that X button in the top of the screen, it's going to be there until you've had a chance to read it and understand it. And I like that because it's not stopping you doing what you were originally trying to do. It's there if you need it. It's not obtrusive. It's not in bright red. It's not going to distract you from whatever you were doing. It's just there if you need it. And if you want to dismiss it, then that's great. Off it goes. Another example down here. So if you pull down to get to Spotlight to search your phone, and I was searching for settings at the time, what I saw was at the bottom of that search, it started to prompt me for certain things that I can do. So it's saying, I can use Siri to turn on low power mode here. And these cycle around. And again, it's not getting in my way, it's not distracting me from what I want to do, but it is just very gently teaching me about some of the things that Siri can do. And again, if you have the do not disturb while driving mode switched on, and you swipe up from the bottom of your phone, or you hit the home button, then these two buttons, I'm not driving and cancel, have been around for a while. But in iOS 13, there's a new one that just kind of full screen says, instead of swiping up from the bottom of your phone and unlocking it and doing something with the keyboard, why not try saying, hey Siri, and doing things that way? So I really like this new style of kind of application or feature discovery inside applications. There's some good examples here. There's also some good examples in the iOS health application. So the first time you launch up health on iOS 13, you'll see things like this. So if you haven't yet set up a medical ID, it's going to, at the top of the scrollable list of things in health, it's going to show you this prompt to maybe prompt you to set up that, or set up one of the new features in iOS 13, which is cycle tracking. And again, these are dismissible. So if you don't want those features, if you don't want to set up a medical ID, it's okay. You just tap the X button. You'll never see it again. You can definitely adopt this kind of pattern in your applications. Even though there's not an enormous amount of space on a mobile device, you can always find space at the top of or at bottom of a list or something like that to just gradually introduce people to the features of your application. Let people dismiss them. And if they do dismiss them, take that as the indication that people are not interested in reading that specific message. So don't pop it up every time, because if this appeared every time, or actually the most annoying one would be this one here, this talk instead of type, because that is quite valuable space on that list of messages where this gets shown. If that came back all the time, then that would start to annoy people. Once you dismiss it, you'll never see it again. So that's important. Another feature of iOS 13, which is great for discovery, is the new context menu API. So this is replacing the peek and pop API, which was fairly well adopted, but never completely adopted by third-party applications. And so in iOS 13, that has changed, and we now have a context menu API as well. So for example, here in Photos, when you tap and hold on a photo or a video, it's going to effectively do that same peek and pop functionality, but it's also going to show you a context menu. So context menus are fantastic, and they are really good for discovery. And we've had context menus on macOS for many, many years, and people know to use context menus for discovery. So for example, in a text editor, if you select some text and you right-click on it, you know that right-clicking is going to show you a list of things that you can do to that text. You can cut it, you can copy it, you can delete it, you can translate it into, uppercase or lowercase or something like that. The context menu API on iOS 13 is exactly the same concept. I've tapped on some content, and I've long pressed on that content to indicate that I am wanting to do something with it, okay? And what it's showing me is 4 different things that I can do with it. I can copy it, I can share it, I can add it as a favorite, or I can delete it. I think that's great because maybe people don't know that you can favorite photos. Maybe they were long pressing on this to delete the photo, but actually now you've just educated them that there is another function without taking up any kind of screen space on the main screen. And Apple are really consistent in their use of this in iOS 13. So these are everywhere. So in Maps and in Notes here, if you long press on any of these bits of content, you're going to get a context menu to show you what functions are behind that. And the good thing is that this API is completely available for you as third-party developers. So take advantage of this. If we teach people that long pressing on a bit of content will show us options on what we can do with that content, then this will just become a completely natural interaction for people to learn how to use our applications. So that's discovery. Let's talk about one final topic. Let's talk about how it works and not how it looks. That's a reference to a very famous Steve Jobs quote, which was, "Design is about how it works, not just how it looks." And we can take inspiration from that quote in our applications to really look at what the platform gives us in terms of non-visual features. So in iOS 13, well, actually, in many versions of iOS now, we've had things like machine learning frameworks. And taking advantage of these machine learning frameworks can make us fit into the operating system much better. So let's again look at how Apple do this. In Photos, if you search for trees or buildings or dog or something like that, it's going to show you pictures of dogs in your photos, because what it's doing is it's passing all of your photos through machine learning to do object recognition on them and then show you, like, dynamically show you the pictures that it thinks are dogs or trees or whatever it is, right? We have these frameworks, so that's one very specific example. If you don't deal with images in your application, maybe that's not what you implement. But these machine learning frameworks, when they were first introduced, they were just very generic. And sometimes it's hard with a generic framework to know how to use it. But in iOS 13, we've got several new APIs that are very specific. So look at those specific machine learning frameworks and figure out, like, let's say if your application does use images, maybe you could do that same kind of analysis of the image to integrate it with search or something like that. There are also APIs in iOS 13 for optical character recognition. So maybe if you're dealing with pictures of text, maybe you're converting those to real text in the background, and maybe that then becomes indexable in your search or something like that. Again, a lot of this is about looking at the new APIs every year and looking at how Apple are using them, and then bringing that to your own applications. The final point I want to make here is about data privacy. So it's a huge topic, and it's a very important topic in modern times. And if you look at what Apple's applications do, again, they're very, very consistent using, first of all, this icon, these two people doing a handshake. That icon has absolutely become standard for Apple to show the user, you're about to learn what we're going to do with your data. And this icon has become recognized by people as like, okay, well, that's what this screen is all about. They also very consistently tell you what they're going to do with your data. And again, if we want to fit in well with the operating system, this is a good practice. So whatever you're doing with your data, use this same icon, tell people what you're doing, button at the bottom to continue. So actually, these do interrupt the user because it's quite important that people know what's happening with your data. So, feeling at home on an operating system is about more than just adopting dark mode or the latest features from the latest operating system. It's about looking at what Apple or Google or any of the platform vendors do really closely and taking a direction from it. I've only talked about a couple of things today, and there are so many things that you can talk about with this subject, but hopefully what you've learned from today is that observing what the platform vendor does is really important to make your application feel at home on the platform. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.